So hello everyone, this is Himanshu, and in today's video I'm going to talk about the concept of asynchronous non-blocking I/O. And what exactly does that mean? That is the question I asked myself when I was beginning with Node.js. So before doing Node.js I had done some JavaScript like basic DOM manipulation and stuff. So document.getElement by ID and setting the inner text of elements on some button clicks, doing some fancy kiddie stuff that people do with JavaScript. But I had never actually dived deeper into JavaScript. But when I started working with Node.js as part of a project, so that is when I actually went a bit deep into how this asynchronous non-blocking IO thing that is with JavaScript works. So basically, JavaScript, even when it is in the browser or even when it is outside the browser, it uses a single thread to execute the user's code. Whatever code that I'm writing, that is going to get executed on a single thread. But whenever you ask JavaScript to perform any operation like an API call or reading or writing to the disk, some DB calls, anything that takes more time than the usual calculations that you do in your code, all those operations are called async operations, and those operations are performed in a non-blocking way so that when those operations are being performed, your main thread is not going to get blocked and it's going to continue executing the code that is written after. So not written after, but basically it's going to continue executing any code that is still there to be executed and is not actually waiting for some asynchronous operation to get completed. So there will be some code that is set to get executed after the asynchronous operation gets completed, and that code, it will put it in a sort of a queue. So that's the concept of the event loop. So once those events are emitted, that is, once that asynchronous operation, okay, I did an API call, I received the response, then I will execute some code. But till the time I'm waiting for that API call, it's not like JavaScript is just going to sit idle. It's going to continue executing the remaining code that it can. And in this video, I'm going to show examples of this very concept. So, but first thing that I need to check though is if my OBS is working properly, because I just set it up recently and I'm directly streaming this video to YouTube. So my stream key and those things are just set, but I need to check if it's actually streaming right now. So yes, seems to be streaming properly. Yes, so we're good to go. And I'm going to start talking about my example. So, okay, I'm going to start with the basic. Uh, Whenever you have to do some asynchronous operation, so the original way of setting some code to get executed after that asynchronous operation gets completed is callback. So we used to use callback functions to basically tell JavaScript to call this function when the asynchronous operation gets completed. So let me show you an example here. So for now, let me just ignore all the other code that's written. So that is for the later part of this video when I'm going to talk about the other things. So let's just focus on this function for now. And let me also comment out this. Sorry, this. Okay. So right now we have a function wait for 5 that says set timeout. And okay, let me also replace this. And let me comment out this as well. Okay, so for now, let me just actually, to make it clearer, let me actually just move this entire thing out here and put it here. Okay, so for now we can just ignore all of this. Okay, this is a code that you need to focus on for now, and believe me that this is just understanding this one small piece of code can actually just make the entire model of how async works clear in your head. So okay, we set a variable x to 5 in the first line, and then we're saying that once 5000 milliseconds have passed, print this line. And last line says to also print the value of x. So as a beginner to Node.js or JavaScript, what would you expect this program to print? You would expect, at least that's what I expected when I was a beginner. So I expected, okay, it's going to wait for 5 seconds, and then it's going to print 5 seconds have passed, and finally it's going to print 5 as the value of x. But that is not how JavaScript works. JavaScript will not get blocked while waiting for those 5 seconds to complete. And this is an asynchronous non-blocking operation. And right here, it's going to print 5, and then once the 5 seconds have passed, it's going to print 5 seconds have passed. And we can verify the same thing. See, it printed 5. It actually executed this line before executing this code, because that function written here, the first argument that we passed to set timeout this function has been set to execute 5 seconds afterwards, but it's not 5 seconds afterwards. And so it's not like JavaScript is just going to sit here and wait for those 5 seconds to complete. It has this code to execute, so it's going to say, okay, once those 5 seconds will pass, I will come back and execute this function, but let me just go and print the value of x first. So that is why you get 5 as the output first line, and the second line here. Okay, so this is the basic concept of a callback. So this is a callback function, a function to get executed after the asynchronous operation gets completed. Okay, so this callback is one way of implementing it, and what is another way of implementing it is using what are called promises. So promises are nothing but objects, and these objects are either going to get resolved or they're going to get rejected. So whenever there is any asynchronous operation, suppose you're making an API call, suppose you're writing something to the DB, that can return a promise object instead of, because that operation is going to take time. So once that operation gets completed, the promise will get resolved with a value. And if there was any error during the operation, then the promise can get rejected. That is the basic concept. So let me actually convert this set timeout to a promise. So let me put it inside a function. Promise wait for 5, something like this. Yes. And inside this, I'm going to use what is called the promise constructor. Return new promise resolve reject. So The promise constructor takes another function, okay, this function as an argument, and this function itself takes resolve and reject as arguments. So this resolve is the function that you have to call when you want to resolve this promise, and this reject is the function that you need to call if you want to reject this promise. Okay, so let me move this set timeout part inside the promise constructor. And so once the 5 seconds have passed, I want to resolve this promise with a value. I am the promises resolve value. Okay, so this promise after 5 seconds will get resolved with this value. And now, so since we move this code to a function, right now it's not going to get executed because we're not calling this function. So we're going to call this function now. Okay, so promise wait for 5, we call this function, and this dot then is a method that every promise object supports, and this method takes in another function as its argument, and that function will get executed when this promise will be resolved. Okay, and this function that we're passing to .then, this arrow function, so I'm assuming that if you're watching this video you're familiar with this arrow function syntax, and so if you're not familiar, so I can just quickly tell you what it is. So instead of writing function a something like this, okay, what I can do is I can instead say const a is equal to this. Okay, so it's just a different way of writing a function. So whatever are the parameters for the function, I put them inside this bracket, and I put an arrow to separate the brackets with the curly braces that define the body of the function. And so it's just you can say a more concise way of writing functions, and it's actually nowadays the preferred best practice to write functions like that. So I'm not going to go too deep into that. So yes, so promise wait for 5. When this promise gets resolved, then execute. So okay, and this function that you want to execute when this promise gets resolved, this will take an argument that will store what value the promise got resolved with. So all promise objects get either resolved or rejected with particular values. Okay, so this resolved with val, let me call this resolved val, and let me just print this console.log resolved with val. So now what do you expect the output to be? The output will be 5, because it's not going to wait for that promise to get resolved. It's going to keep executing this. So 5 will be the first line that's printed, and once those 5 seconds have passed, it's going to print okay, 5 seconds have passed, and it's going to resolve this entire promise with this value, and the promise is resolved value. And when that promise is going to get resolved, then this function is going to get called, and we're going to see this value get printed. Okay, so let me just execute this. 5 seconds have passed, and the promises resolved value. See, that is how you can use a promise instead of a callback. So earlier, so at the base, the first operation that is non-blocking, the first non-blocking operation that we are doing is this set timeout. That was using callbacks, but we abstracted away that thing and put it into a promise, and with the help of that promise object we can simply use the .then syntax. And then what you also need to know is that the then method of a promise, it takes this function, okay, and then it also returns another promise. So you can put another dot then and give it another function. So let me also put like this. Yeah. So because this promise, so the promise that this dot then will return, this one that I'm highlighting right now, this promise will actually get resolved with a null or an undefined value, because we are not actually returning a promise from inside this method. If we were to return a promise from inside, then this dot then will actually return that same promise. But right now we are not actually doing anything, so it will just print undefined or null. So once 5 seconds will pass, 5 seconds have passed, promise is resolved. Right? So see, because this value is not actually, so if I return 2, yes, so this 2 will then become the value with which the promise returned by this dot then method will get resolved, and that 2 will get assigned to this resolved with value 2 variable. And so let me actually just reduce the timer to 2 seconds so that you can see the output faster. You see, 5 seconds have passed and the promise is resolved value, and once this promise got resolved, then called we printed out the value. So whatever you return inside this method, that becomes the resolved value for the next promise. Okay, and another interesting thing to note is that this dot then method, it takes 2 functions as arguments. So mostly you will see people passing only one function, but you can also pass in another function, and this one is called onRejected, and that function will be executed when this promise gets rejected. Okay, so suppose after 2 seconds I'm going to reject this promise instead of resolving it. Okay, so I'm going to reject this promise, so after 5 seconds this is going to get rejected. Okay, so just to make it more clear, I'm removing that second part, and I'm going to provide a function to be executed when the promise wait for 5 promise gets rejected. Okay, rejected with value, and we can do the same thing. We can print yes, and one thing that we need to make sure is that our brackets are aligning. Yes, so now you will see that after 2 seconds it prints the value checked value. Okay, so it will now print after 2 seconds. It will go to this line. It will not execute this. It will not execute this first function because this promise is going to get rejected. So it will only execute this function. So that you can actually very easily check. So so we will get promise rate 5 got rejected, and I am the promises reject value finally. So what will be the output? 5 will get printed first. No one's waiting for those 2 seconds to pass. Okay, we are asynchronous. We're not going to wait for anyone. Synchronous operations wait. They sync. Whenever you sync files to some system, to your Google Drive, in that scenario as well, you're syncing. You're waiting for file changes from one place to get to the other place, right? But async means you're not going to wait. So synchronous communication is when you're chatting with other people. Asynchronous is when you just send them an email and you don't really wait for them to actually read and respond. So that's the general sense around the word async. And as I explained how it's used in the concept in the context of programming. So after 2 seconds, sorry, I should have changed this to 2, but you get the idea, right? Promise rate 5 got rejected and the promise reject value. So this function was not executed, only this was executed. Okay, and now let me show you one more thing lastly, that you don't need to pass this rejection function as the second argument to .then. You can also pass it as a function to a .catch, and this .catch will only take one function as argument, and that will get executed if the promise gets rejected. Okay, so this promise rate 5 got rejected. There was no function provided to the .then to execute in case it gets rejected. So what this .then does is it will return a rejected promise with the same rejection value that this returned, and that rejection value is this. Now the promise that this .then returns, that gets rejected, and there is a catch block that you have written to catch the value with which this promise gets rejected, and right here you're catching that value and printing it. So as you will see now, the same output will be produced. 2 seconds have passed, promise rate 5 got rejected. So this .catch block was executed, this then block was not executed. And what this .then did, it also returned another rejected promise. So because the original promise that got rejected was this promise also got rejected because we did not provide anything to handle the rejection of this previous promise. To handle the rejection of this promise, we could either have provided something here, but since we did not do that, then this then returned another promise, and that had a handler to handle the rejection, and that is the entire concept of promises. So in the next video, I will also be covering how there has been syntactical improvements that have allowed us to use promises without actually using such a lengthy syntax, the promise constructor and .then, .catch. We can just simply use the keyword async, and within async functions we can use the keyword await, and that helps us to write asynchronous code very neatly. So till then, uh, just go just listen to this video again if you don't understand anything, and ask your doubts in the comments, and I hope you will understand the concept and you will like this video, and I will see you next time.